Hello and welcome to this video for week 2 in which we're exploring the concept of literariness. This video is going to build on the first one and pose the question, can spoken narratives be literary? So in the first video we explored sort of expectations and assumptions around different genres and which we would expect to be literary and which we would expect to be non-literary. We talked about different features that literary texts have been proposed over the years by various researchers to contain. So a very kind of crude distinction that we might be able to initially make, sort of a hypothesis for us to start with and then pull apart and investigate a little bit, might be something like written texts, and particularly fictional texts, are often considered to have more literary features than spoken ones, and in particular spoken ones that are perhaps more transient. So if we think about something like a political speech, for instance, we may situate that somewhere in between a spoken or a written narrative or a written bit of text. Because whilst it's something which is spoken, it's also something which is performed and has probably been written down and carefully crafted beforehand. If we compare that, for instance, to a story that you might tell a friend about what was going on at your weekend or an exciting thing that happened to you in a more social situation, we might think of that as more prototypically a spoken narrative, so something which is probably not recorded, that perhaps a huge amount of thought hasn't necessarily gone into constructing, and that probably isn't sort of written down or recorded in a particular way. So in a very crude sense, we might say that those kinds of narratives, those kinds of texts that are spoken, that are transient, that sort of throwaway in some senses, may have fewer features of literariness than those kind of fictional, very worked upon, carefully developed and crafted written texts. That's going to be our initial start point, and we're going to investigate that claim today. So let's start off then by thinking about narrative. And by narrative, I mean something which is perhaps not just a conversation, but something which involves some aspect of storytelling. This is actually a huge area of research. There are people who work in a field called narratology who spend years and years and have a particular interest in defining what we might mean by narrative. We're not going to go into it in that level of detail, but I'm going to suggest to you that there are some features that various researchers over the years, if you're interested in this area, Michael Toulon has a brilliant book called Narrative that is a really good place to start if you would like to investigate this further. But I'm just going to outline some of the research and the claims about what counts as a narrative. So if we're thinking about written text versus spoken text, and we're focusing on this particular thing that I'm terming narrative, what do I mean by that? So some researchers argue that in order for it to be a narrative, as opposed to, for instance, a conversation, that a text, whether that's something spoken or whether it's written, has to possess certain features. And there's quite a lot of agreement in the field, in particular in earlier work, that it has to focus on the inclusion of some sort of event. So unless some sort of event is being reported, whether that's in a spoken or a written context, that it's probably not something we would want to refer to as a narrative. William Labov, who those of you who've done English language at A-level may have come across before, is quite a famous researcher in the States, has done a lot of work in this area and is very interested in defining what counts as a narrative, and in particular how people tell stories to each other. I'm going to talk to you about his work in a bit more detail later in the video. But he offers this definition. He argues that there has to be some sort of event and there has to be some sort of passage of time that is narrated within this story in order for us to consider it a narrative. And he refers to this as at least one temporal juncture. So in other words, this was a state of affairs, then something happened, and that there's some sort of transition from one state to another. This happened and then something else happened. And he says as long as we've got that, we can think about that as a narrative. So if you just want to take a moment to reflect back on the text that you identified last week, of thinking about things that you thought were works of literature, things that you think are objectively of high quality, I imagine that if you reflect on those, you will see that there are some sort of temporal juncture, some sort of passage of time, some sort of reporting of an event in all of those texts. And he says that this is also true in relation to spoken narratives. So when we tell each other stories, that we report some sort of event and there is some sort of passage of time, some sort of temporal juncture, some sort of shift. In more recent years, however, other researchers have suggested that narratives are as much to do with characters, whether or not they're real or fictional, as they are to do with events, and that in particular, for us to consider a story good, there has to be some sort of work going on in that narrative about character, people that we care about. So whether that is someone who's completely imaginary and made up, or whether that's a story that you're telling and offering a real person that you know as a character in this story, or someone is telling you a story that involves people that you may know or may not know, that characters are also somehow important. Richard Gehrig, who is a really interesting cognitive psychologist who's done a lot of work in this area, and in particular thinking about how we process and understand narratives, what happens in our minds when people tell us a story, has even argued that just a single word could count as a narrative, because listeners or readers may conjure up a story on their own. So the example he uses is the word Texas. So assuming that you know what Texas is and where Texas is and know a few things about it, that as soon as somebody mentions that word to you, that it conjures up in your mind some sort of setting in which things may happen. And you may even have sort of prototypical stories that you would associate with that setting. So those are three sort of different, quite distinct definitions that we could offer around narrative. And as I move through the video, we're going to explore which of these definitions we feel is most accurate, which ones we subscribe to, maybe we agree with more than one of these researchers. But I think that it's important, as we mull these ideas over, to think about narrative as part of spoken interaction, and actually how prolific, how common it is that spoken narrative arises in the course of interactions that we have with other people on a day-to-day basis. So people like Jerome Bruner have argued that the narratives are crucial to our construction of our self-identity, so our sense of who we are. So he would argue that even if we don't ever sit with another person and tell them a story about something that's happened to us, that internally in our minds, that we do this all the time to ourselves. He argues that our memories are all stories that we tell ourselves. He says that we become the autobiographical narratives which we tell to ourselves and to others about our lives, that we have a sense that we're not just animals wandering through the world in an aimless and kind of purposeless fashion, but that we have a sense of identity. And a lot of that sense of identity comes from these stories that we tell ourselves and tell other people about who we are and the things that we do and the events that happen to us. Schriffen, I think, builds on this, thinking about external identity that we create for others. He says that we verbally place our past experiences in and make them relevant to a particular here and now, a particular audience, and a particular set of interactional concerns and interpersonal issues. So again, building on some of the things we discussed in the last video about thinking about textual or contextual lenses that we can apply to thinking about analysing these stories, you can see that there are aspects of both kind of going on in these definitions and these explorations of narrative. That part of this is about stories that we tell, that they have particular textual features. They include a passage of time, they include characters, they include some sort of event. So those are things we could think about in terms of them being textual features. But that also, Schiffen argues that we also have lots of contextual things going on about when we think about which stories we want to tell other people, and that is informed by all sorts of sets of contextual considerations that may operate at a conscious or unconscious level of our awareness. That the idea that we tell stories to people and that it creates an identity for ourselves, that it's not just something that is just passing the time, but that in telling these stories that we are constructing for other people a sense of our identity, be that as something that we're a person who is interested in these kinds of things, or that these particular events have happened to, or even just that we're an interesting person, that we're a good storyteller. That the stories that we're going to tell merit other people stopping their conversation and giving us an extended turn to tell this story that we think is merits other people hearing. So some typical features of narratives. Some of these, I think, cohere quite closely with some of the features that we talked about in the first video around literariness. And here, I think, is where we can start to unpick a little bit where the distinctions actually are, or how fair we think it is to say that fictional works that have been crafted and constructed over a long time, perhaps that these are literary, these are creative, and that spoken transient narratives might not be. So I'm going to read through this list for you first and just explain a few of these features, and then try and connect some of those things to these concepts of creativity and literariness that we have discussed so far. So Tulin, who I mentioned at the start of the video, offers these. He says that all narratives involve a degree of artificial fabrication or constructedness, not usually apparent in spontaneous conversation. So narrative is something which has been worked upon. So even if that's something that's just happened to you, and that you come in and you meet a group of people and you say, you'll never believe what just happened to me, that in that process that there are decisions that we make about which parts of that event that we've just experienced to include, and that necessarily involves some degree of working upon that narrative. We can think about that in a more elaborated way, think about the stories that are your stories that you tell again and again, perhaps because you feel that they're particularly interesting or you particularly enjoy them, you like recounting them, that perhaps the more times we do that, the more worked upon those narratives become. You may have things about the way in which you deliver them, places where you pause, things that you include, things that you don't. And this Tulin describes as some degree of prefabrication. So that can be something that's momentary or something that actually people do over a really extended period of time, in shifting this thing from an experience that we've had to something that we're sharing with other people, or perhaps even telling back to ourselves, that some sort of prefabrication goes on. It says that typically narratives tend to have a trajectory, so we expect them to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And you can see hopefully there that there is a point of contact there between what Labov's saying, that it involves some sort of event, some sort of temporal juncture, that this happened, this was what it was like at the beginning, then this event happened in the middle, and that we expect some sort of rounding up. And there's lots of really interesting research about stories that have ambiguous endings or feel like they end very abruptly, that some people really dislike that and find it very difficult to cope with, because they feel like it lacks closure. So I won't spoil it for you, but if anybody has seen or read Life of Pi, this is a really good example of a text where it has an ending which is very ambiguous. And some people who dislike the ending of that story do so precisely because they expect it to have a clear ending and feel that it lacks one. That all narratives have some sort of teller, no matter how backgrounded or invisible they are, and that teller plays a role in the telling of the story. So it's not just about the text, it's also about the person telling it, and that too is important. Whether that is in the context of a written narrative, where we know that there's an author who's existed somewhere at some point and has written those things down, or whether that's face to face, you can see the teller as they're telling you the story. That it's richly exploitative of displacement. That one's a little bit more tricky, so I'm just going to pull that apart for you a little bit now. There are lots of research around language, and particular distinctions between humans' ability to communicate and use language and other species' ability to do this. So humans are one of the only species who are able to talk about events or communicate things about events that aren't happening right in the here and now, that we can talk about things that happened in the past, things that may happen in the future. And as we observe all sorts of animal interaction, that certainly there are other species that are capable of communicating, but very, very few can talk about things that happened in the past, or things that we imagine that aren't real, that are hypotheticals that may happen in the future. There are some species of monkey, if you're interested, that show some signs of being able to do this, but other species is very, very few and far between. And that narratives involve recalling of happenings that may not only be spatially but temporally remote. So talking about things that happened in other places, things that happened in other spaces. So today we're sort of considering how far these features can be said to apply to spoken and written narratives, and what similarities and differences might exist between narratives told through these two language mediums. And obviously today we're thinking about that with a particular focus on this concept of literariness, of how far that factors into our assumptions about whether something is of good quality, whether or not it's literary, whether or not we would consider it to be creative. So as an initial kind of crude distinction, we could say that spoken narratives typically occur as part of a conversation. So often they tend to be collaborative in a way that written narratives aren't. So even if you are telling a story to a group of friends and nobody interrupts you, that you may be looking at how that story is being received. You may clock things like body language. If people are getting out their phones and don't seem to be particularly interested, perhaps you ramp up the interest of it, or you cut it short because you're worried about being cut off. If people look really gripped, perhaps you might take more time over telling that story. And that in itself is an aspect of collaboration. So perhaps this isn't just the speaker producing this narrative, but also the listeners have an active involvement in it as well. It may also be that you get more active forms of collaboration of other people stopping and asking questions, asking for clarification, asking for more detail, telling somebody to hurry up. By contrast, written or literary narratives we may think about as being more fixed. So it's something that somebody writes down in a space or a place that is temporarily and spatially remote, and then gives it to somebody else, whether that is the act of actually physically giving it to them, or it being published and them going and picking it up in a bookshelf, from a bookshelf, opening it and reading it again. There are lost opportunities there for that kind of collaboration. So a reader can interpret a text differently from another reader, but they can't materially determine the form and content of a story. So they can't tell somebody to stop or to ask more questions as they go in a way that will change the narrative. So thinking about that degree of kind of prefabrication and something being worked upon, there is a distinction that we could draw out there, I think, about the opportunities for that to take place, and in particular for people who are receiving that narrative, whether it's listening to it or reading it, to intervene in that process of telling. So somebody I've mentioned who was very interested in this field of research and is a very kind of big name in this field is William Labov, and I've got a picture for you of him there. He's now in his 90s, I believe. He still works and has an office hour at the University of Philadelphia. And he was very interested in this idea about spoken narrative. And so he conducted research with a group of colleagues based largely in Harlem in America. And he was particularly interested in accent and dialect, but was also interested in this aspect of what counts as a story, what kind of features does it contain. So he went round with a tape recorder around the streets of Harlem and asked people that he met to tell him stories. And then he took that collection of stories and looked at what kind of patterns he could identify. And a particular question that he asked them was, tell me about a time that your life was in danger. And what he found was really interesting was that regardless of who he spoke to, when he asked them that question, that people tended to respond with a narrative, they tended to respond with a story. That it clearly, in many cases, was something that had these hallmarks of it had an event, it had a temporal juncture, it had degrees of prefabrication, of being kind of worked upon and crafted, but that it also followed a particular structure, that this was common across people that he spoke to. He says often these stories will have some sort of initial summary. Let me tell you about what just happened to me. That would be some sort of abstract, an indication to the people who are listening about the kind of story that the teller is about to tell. That it then often involves some sort of orientation of anchoring of the perspective of the person who's telling it, perhaps the other characters there. So if we take that example that I just offered you, I might say, you won't believe just what just happened to me. Look, I was outside, I was walking along the street. So I'm establishing myself, I, using that pronoun as a character there, and I'm walking along, I'm doing something, and I'm on a street. So there's a sense of setting, an orientation that's going on there as well. Again, things that we might initially think about, thinking about characters and setting as things that are to do with written works, to do with literary works, to do with fiction, but are also, interestingly, present in spoken narratives that we tell as well. That there's some sort of complicating action, some sort of event. So I'm not just walking along the street. You're expecting that as I tell you that story, that then something is going to happen that's going to complicate this, that escalates it from me just walking from point A to where I am at point B to tell this story, to something that escalates it to something that I feel is a story, is something that is worthy of telling. Suddenly a bus came out of nowhere, for instance, would be an example of a complicating action. Initially, in his model, he said that then we tend to get an evaluation, a point of telling the story, and that's why I'm late, for instance, or that's why I'm out of breath. Oh, it was so exciting. Some sort of reason, some sort of point of the telling. Labov actually went back and revised this model and said typically we get evaluation that all the way through stories, that it can occur at any point. And he says that this is often because when we talk to one another, that when we tell a story, we're often asking for a longer turn, and therefore we kind of want to maintain our listeners' interest, and we want to stop people interrupting us so that it's performing a kind of function, because often it can be identity threatening, it can be quite unpleasant. If you're halfway through a story and people get their phones out, people say, oh, we're not interested, shut up, isn't a pleasant experience. So he says this evaluation is often fed through the story to constantly reinforce to listeners that this is a story of interest, that it's worth telling, and crucially, that it's worth allowing that person to continue to tell it. That it involves some sort of resolution or some sort of results. And now I'm here, and then this bus came out of nowhere, and I jumped out of the way, and it only just missed me. That would be a sort of a conclusion to the story. So again, you can see that there are links there between what Tulin was saying around narratives tending to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and what Labov was actually able to observe and bear out in the evidence when he went and asked people to tell these stories. And that finally there is some sort of code or some sort of ending that tells people that the story is over, and that sometimes these two categories can be sort of blurred together. So you might say, well, anyway, what has everyone else been up to? It's signalling that the story is over and that you can kind of continue. One other way in which you can think about these is that narratives can be thought about as a series of answers to underlying questions. So we could think about that abstract as, what is this story about? The orientation is giving us the who, the when, the what, the where. The complicating action is then telling us what happened. The evaluation is the so what, why you should listen to this story. And the resolution is what then happened finally. And Labov says that typically narratives can include all of these factors, but only the complicating action seems to actually be necessary. So he found examples where perhaps other aspects of these story structures were missing, but there was always some sort of complicating action. And this is where this idea about narratives always reporting some sort of event comes from and seems to be evidenced in the linguistic studies that have investigated this. Here's just an example for you. I'm not going to read through it in detail, but if anyone's familiar with the old show, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, sort of brought Will Smith to fame. There's a very famous kind of song that's the theme at the opening of that. And this, I think, is a really interesting example that actually fits very, very formulaically with this structure that Labov described. And it may be interesting for you to sort of pause and reflect now about whether or not you think that this is a literary narrative. Where do we count this on the spectrum from being something which is written to something which is spoken? Thinking about ideas like foregrounding and many of those features that we discussed in the first video, things like rhyme, things like assonance for alliteration, things like, content, what sort of things are we sort of discussing here? You can see that actually this has many of those hallmarks and perhaps sits somewhere in the middle of that kind of assessment between something being literary or non-literary. The final thing I want to talk to you about in this video is pulling apart a little bit more and going into a bit more detail about this idea about evaluation and a concept that Labov termed tellability. So he says that whilst stories always include complicating actions, actually from an identity point of view, or thinking about whether or not we deem a story to be of good quality, whether we deem it to be interesting, enjoyable, something that was worth our time to listen to or worth our time to read, that evaluation is the kind of the most crucial factor in this, and this is what he says. He says, the means used by the narrator, this is his description of evaluation. Evaluation is the means used by the narrator to indicate the point of the narrative. It's raison d'etre, meaning it's reason to be. Why it was told and what the narrator is getting at. There are many ways to tell the same story, to make different points or to make no points at all. Pointless stories are met in English with the withering rejoinder, so what? Every good narrator is continually warding off this question. And this might be an interesting definition for you to reflect on, thinking about good literary narratives, written narratives, texts that you've come across that you enjoyed, that you think are good, ones that you think are bad. Is it something about evaluation that you're contemplating or not having to contemplate the so what of why should I be listening to this story as a possible kind of motivator for that assessment of quality, that assessment of creativity, that assessment of how interesting or enjoyable that story is. And similarly, we could think about this in terms of everybody has people in their lives, and one of the tasks associated with this video is I'm going to ask you to reflect on this. We all know people who we think are really good at telling stories, and we all know people who we think aren't very good. And it might be interesting to reflect whether this whether or not we raise this question when we're listening to stories that people tell us about, so what, why are you telling me this, could offer an account as to how we make those assessments. So Labov built this into introducing this concept that he calls tellability, which he defines as: to identify the evaluative portion of a narrative, it is necessary to know why this narrative or any narrative is felt to be tellable. In other words, why the events of the narrative are reportable. So essentially he says that as we move through our day-to-day lives, lots of things happen to us that we forget straight away, that things that we never tell back to ourselves, we never really think about, and that beyond that, there are lots of things that happen that we never tell to other people. But that there are some things that have this quality of tellability, that we perceive that they merit being reported, of being shared with other people, or merit, space in our memory to be remembered and reflected upon. And he says that this is something which distinguishes events that happen to us and experiences that we have, that we transform into narratives, from ones that we leave and don't. And we could extend that to thinking about literariness and thinking about written texts, about what are the kind of stories that are worth our time and our energy and our effort and our investment to sit down and read. And he explores this idea about what gives a story tellability. And he says that tellability is something which is subjectively determined, usually first by the teller and then also the addressee. So if we were to think about this in relation to perhaps a fictional literary work, we might think, okay, well, an author somewhere comes up with a story, deems that it's tellable, writes it down, crafts it, works upon it, and they may judge subjectively that that's a good story and it's tellable. But then, as a reader, when you pick up that story, you can also make that subjective determination. And if you don't agree with the author that it's something which has tellability, that's probably the point at which you stop reading. If you come across something you think is highly tellable, that might be something where you find it's a book that's very difficult to put down. Similarly, in a kind of face-to-face scenario, we know that tellability is subjectively determined because somebody who starts telling us a story has obviously decided that this event that happened is worthy of being told, but then it's also up to the listeners to judge that to also be the case. And if you're in a face-to-face context, this may be a scenario that can become quite uncomfortable, where if the listeners disagree with the teller, that they may stop paying attention, or they may even cut the teller off. So tellability can also be context dependent, and according to Labov, some narratives concern matters that are always reportable, so those are sort of less context dependent, and some of them aren't so much. So the danger of death or physical injury is an example that he offers, that typically when we're telling stories that involve danger of death or physical injury, that they're almost always deemed to be reportable. But that if you have a very close relationship with somebody, you may find yourself discussing things and telling them stories about things that are very mundane, like what you had for breakfast, or what you did when you were at work today, that in many other scenarios we wouldn't deem to be tellable, but because of the place that we're in and the person we're telling them to, perhaps a partner, perhaps a parent or a caregiver or a sibling, that they may have a lower threshold for judging what we might consider to be tellable. On the other hand, though, he says even things like reporting experiences of death, danger, or physical injury can become things which feel less tellable depending on the context. So he says if the event becomes common enough, it is no longer a violation of an expected rule of behaviour, and it is not reportable. Evaluative devices say to us, this was terrifying, dangerous, weird, wild, crazy, or amusing, hilarious, or wonderful. More generally, that it was strange, uncommon, or unusual, that it was worth reporting. It was not ordinary, plain, humdrum, everyday, or run-of-the-mill. So that perhaps if you get somebody who lives a life where they are frequently in danger of death or physical injury, that threshold is what counts as tellable amongst those stories becomes higher and higher. So it's very, very subjective in those kinds of terms. So to summarise then, we could think about some similarities between spoken, more transient narratives and things that are written, or that we might consider to have this feature of literariness, as having lots of similarities. So perhaps literary features can also be found in many spoken narratives, that their structure and ordering tend to be similar. So fictional works, just like stories that we tell in the course of interacting with people on the day-to-day, often have beginnings, middles and ends. that both contain features of point of view, that they come from a teller, that there is somebody's eyes through which we're being asked to look, that both can involve manipulations of time or order. So spoken narratives can jump backwards and forwards in the same way that we might think about things like flashbacks in fictional works. That narrator reliability can be an issue for both. So there is a degree of trust that we're being asked to put in a teller, whether that's a real person who's in a room with us or on a Zoom call with us, or whether that's a fictional character that's reporting a story to us in a novel, that we're being asked to trust that the events that we're being told are true, and sometimes that's not always the case. And that both often contain representations of speech and thought. So I may say, this bus came out of nowhere and I thought to myself, oh my goodness, I'm about to die. And I screamed and shouted, get out of the way. Those would be representations of speech and thought. Again, things which in a very unnuanced way we might associate with literary works, but if we're going to accept that as a literary feature, then we're going to have to say that those too can appear in spoken narratives as well as written ones. So thank you very much for listening. I'm really looking forward to building on these ideas with you in the live session, and I know that you'll have really productive conversations about this with Dave as well. So if you take a look at the tasks at this point associated with this video, I hope you'll find this a fruitful exploration, and I look forward to building on these ideas with you as we move forward in the module. Thank you very much for your attention.